Okay, so this is Daf Yomi. We're in Tractate Avodah Zarah, Daf 43. At the end of 42, it says, the Gemara asks, if it is referring to a case where one forms a figure, say the last clause of Rav Sheshet's statement, all figures are permitted except for the figure of a dragon. And if it is referring to a case where one forms a figure, it is it is forming the figure of a dragon prohibited. But isn't it written, you shall not make with me gods of silver or gods of gold. So the sages interpret this verse as referring to the heavenly constellations, which indicates that it is prohibited to form only these figures, but it is not prohibited to form a figure of a dragon. Rather, the Gemara concludes it is obvious that this halakha is referring to a case where one finds a vessel with the figure of a dragon, and this is as we learned in a Mishnah. In the case of one who finds vessels, and upon them is the figure of the sun, a figure of the moon, or a figure of a dragon, he must take them and cast them into the Dead Sea. So the Gemara asks about the lack of consistency between the clauses of Rav Sheshet's statement. Can it be that the first clause and the last clause are referring to a case where one finds vessels with the specified figures, and the middle clause is referring to a case where one forms these figures? Abaye said, indeed, the first clause and the last clause are referring to cases where one finds vessels with figures, and the middle clause is referring to a case where one forms figures. Rava says the entire statement of Rav Sheshet is referring to a case where one finds vessels with these figures, and the middle clause is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, as it is taught in Braita that Rabbi Yehuda adds to the list of forbidden figures even a figure of a nursing woman and Serapis. So that's SAR space APIS. So this is the name of the god Serapis. So this is like SERAPIS. And this is kind of like the proto-Jesus for the Egyptians, whose worship originated in ancient Egypt and Greece and spread throughout the Roman Empire, including Eretz Israel. So some people think that the concept of Jesus came from Serapis, I guess how you want to call that. So the figure of Serapis is worshipped as it symbolizes Yosef, who ruled over, or Sar, and appeased Memphis, the entire world, by distributing food during the 7 years of famine. See Genesis chapter 41. But the figure of Serapis is forbidden only when it is holding a dry measure and measuring with it. And the figure of a nursing woman is forbidden only when she is holding a child and nursing it. So that's like the mother, Mary Jesus kind of like, I don't know what you want to call that relationship there. So the sages taught, what is a figure of a dragon? So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar explained, it is any figure that has scales between its joints. Rabbi Asi motioned with his hands to depict scales between the joints of the neck. So Rabbi Chama, son of Rabbi Hanina, says, the halakha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Okay, so Rabbi Barbachana says that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, once I was following Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, the distinguished, on the road, and he found a ring there, and there was a figure of a dragon on it. And he then encountered a minor Gentile boy, but did not say anything to him. He then encountered an adult Gentile and said to him, revoke the ring's idolatrous status. But the Gentile did not revoke it. So Rabbi Elazar HaKapar then slapped him across his face, whereupon the Gentile succumbed and revoked its idolatrous status. The Gemara comments, learn from this incident the following three halachot. So learn from it that a Gentile can revoke the idolatrous status of both his object of idol worship and that of another Gentile. And learn from the fact that Rabbi Elazar HaKapar waited to find an adult Gentile, that only one who is aware of the nature of idol worship and its accessories can revoke the idol status, but one who is not aware of the nature of idol worship and its accessories, such as a minor, cannot revoke the idol status. And finally, learn from it that a Gentile can revoke the status of an idol even against his will. So Rabbi Hanina ridiculed this ruling and asked, but why was it necessary to have a Gentile actively revoke the idolatrous status of the ring? Doesn't Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, the distinguished, maintain in accordance with that which he learned in a Braita. In the case of one who saves an object from a lion, or from a bear, or from a cheetah, or from a troop of soldiers, or from a river, or from the tide of the sea, or from the flooding of a river, or similarly one who finds an object in a main thoroughfare, or in a large plaza, or for that matter anywhere frequented by the public. In all these cases, the objects belong to him because the owners despair of recovering them. Therefore, in the case of a lost ring with an idolatrous figure on it, its idolatrous status is automatically revoked as its owner despairs of recovering it. So Abaye said, granted, the owner despairs of recovering the object itself, but does he despair of its forbidden idolatrous status? The owner does not assume that the object will never be worshipped again. Rather, he says to himself, if a Gentile finds it, he will worship it. If a Jew finds it, since it is valuable, he will sell it to a Gentile who will then worship it. Therefore, Rabbi Elazar HaKapar had to have the ring's idolatrous status revoked. We learned in a Mishnah there, so Rosh Hashanah 24a, Rabban Gamliel had diagrams of different figures of moons drawn on a tablet that hung on the wall of his attic, which he would show to the ordinary people who came to testify about sighting the new moon, but were unable to adequately describe what they had seen. And he would say to them, did you see an image like this, or did you see an image like that? So the Gemara asks, and is it permitted to form these figures? But isn't it written, you shall not make with me gods of silver or gods of gold, Exodus 20:20, which is interpreted to mean, you shall not make figures of my attendants who serve before me, that is, those celestial bodies that were created to serve God, including the sun and the moon. So in answering, Abaye said the Torah prohibited only the figures of those attendants that one can possibly reproduce something that is truly in their likeness. Since it is impossible to reproduce the sun and the moon, the prohibition does not apply to these entities. As it is taught in a Braita, a person may not construct a house in the exact image of the sanctuary, or a portico in the exact image of the entrance hall of the sanctuary, nor a courtyard corresponding to the temple courtyard, nor a table corresponding to the table in the temple, nor a candelabrum corresponding to the candelabrum in the temple. But one may fashion a candelabrum of 5 or of 6 or of 8 lamps. And one may not fashion a candelabrum of 7 lamps, even if he constructs it from other kinds of metal rather than gold. As in extenuating circumstances, the candelabrum in the temple may be fashioned from other metals. The Braita continues. Rabbi Yoshi Bar Yehuda says, one may not fashion a candelabrum of wood either, in the manner that the kings of the Hasmonean monarchy fashioned it. When they first purified the temple, they had to fashion the candelabrum out of wood, as no other material was available. Since a wooden candelabrum is fit for the temple, it is prohibited to fashion one of this kind for oneself. The rabbi said to Rabbi Yoshi Bar Yehuda, do you cite a proof from there, that is the Hasmoneans, that a candelabrum fashioned of wood is fit for the temple? During that era, the branches of the candelabrum were fashioned from spits, or shapudim, of iron, and they covered them with tin. Later, when they grew richer and could afford a candelabrum from silver, they grew even richer, and they fashioned the candelabrum from gold. In any event, Abaye proves from this Braita that the prohibition against forming a figure applies only to items that can be reconstructed in an accurate manner. Since this is not possible in the case of the moon, Rabban Gamliel's figures were permitted. The Gemara asks, and is it actually permitted to fashion figures of those attendants of God, concerning which it is impossible to reproduce their likeness? But isn't it taught in the Braita that the verse, quote, you shall not make with me gods of silver, Exodus 20:20, is interpreted to mean you should not make figures of my attendants who serve before me on high. Apparently this includes the sun and the moon. Abaye said, this does not include the sun and the moon, as the Torah prohibits the fashioning only of a figure of all 4 faces of the creatures of the divine chariot together. So Ezekiel 1:10. All other figures which are not in the likeness of the ministering angels are permitted. The Gemara raises a difficulty. If that is so, let the fashioning of a figure of a human face alone be permitted. Why then is it taught in a Braita, figures of all faces are permitted except for the human face? So Rav Yehuda, son of Rav Yehoshua, said, I heard in a lecture of Rabbi Yehoshua that there is a different reason why one may not fashion a figure of a human face. The verse states, quote, and you shall not make with me, that is E.T., Exodus 20:20. This can be read as, you shall not make me, or O.T. Since the human being was created in the image of God, Genesis 1:27, it is prohibited to fashion an image of a human being, but fashioning figures of other attendants of God is permitted. So the Gemara asks, and is it permitted to fashion figures of other attendants of God? But isn't it taught in another Braita that the verse, quote, and you shall not make with me gods of silver, Exodus 20:20, is interpreted to mean that you shall not make figures of my attendants who serve before me on high, for example, Ophanim and Seraphim and the sacred Hayot and the ministering angels. Abaye said the Torah prohibits fashioning figures of only those attendants that are in the upper heaven, that is the supreme angels in the highest firmament, but it does not prohibit fashioning the celestial bodies, the sun and the moon, despite the fact that they too are located in the heaven. The Gemara asks, and is it permitted to fashion figures of those bodies that are in the lower heaven? But isn't it taught in a Braita, with regard to the verse, you shall not make for yourselves any graven image, nor any manner of likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Exodus 20, verse 4. The phrase, that is in the heaven, serves to include the sun and the moon, the stars and the constellations. The term above serves to include the ministering angels. Apparently it is prohibited to fashion a figure even of the celestial bodies that are in the lower heaven. So the Gemara answers, when that Braita is taught, it is in reference to the prohibition against worshiping them. There's no prohibition against forming a figure in their likeness. The Gemara asks, if the Braita is referring to the prohibition against worshiping them, then why does it mention only celestial bodies? It is prohibited to worship even a tiny worm. The Gemara answers, yes, it is indeed so, and this prohibition is derived from the latter clause of that verse, as it is taught in a Braita. That is in the earth serves to include seas and rivers, mountains, and hills. The word beneath serves to include a tiny worm. The Gemara asked, and is the mere fashioning the figures of the celestial bodies permitted? But isn't it taught in another Braita that the verse, you shall not make with me gods of silver, Exodus 20:20, is interpreted to mean that you shall not make figures of my attendants who serve before me on high, for example, the sun and the moon and the stars and the constellations. This is proof that it is prohibited to fashion figures of the sun and the moon. Consequently, the solution proposed by Abaye is rejected, leaving the difficulty of Rabban Gamliel's diagram unresolved. The Gemara proposes an alternative resolution. The case of Rabban Gamliel is different, as others, Gentiles, fashion those figures for him, and it is prohibited for a Jew only to fashion such figures. There is no prohibition against having them in one's possession. The Gemara asks, but there is the case of Rav Yehuda, where others fashioned for him a seal with a figure of a person on it, and Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, who was his student, sharp-witted one, destroy this one's eyes, that is, disfigure it, as it is prohibited even to have a figure of a human being in one's possession. The Gemara answers there, in the case of Rav Yehuda, his was a protruding seal, that is, the figure projected from the ring, and Shmuel prohibited it due to the potential suspicion that he had an object of idol worship in his possession. As it is taught in Braita, the case of a ring whose seal protrudes, it is prohibited to place it on one's finger due to suspicion of idol worship. But it is permitted to seal objects with it. In this case, the act of sealing forms a figure that is sunken below the surface, of the object upon which the seal is impressed, which is not prohibited. If its seal is sunken, it is permitted to place it on one's finger, but it is prohibited to seal objects with it, as that forms a protruding figure. So the Gemara asks, and are we concerned about arousing suspicion due to the use of a human figure? But what about the synagogue that was destroyed in Eretz Yisrael and was reestablished in Nahardea, and they erected a statue of the king in it? And nevertheless, Shmuel's father and Levi would enter and pray in it, and they were not concerned about arousing suspicion. The Gemara answers, a public institution is different. The public is not suspected of having idolatrous intentions. Rather, it is assumed that the status is there exclusively for ornamental purposes. The Gemara asks, but wasn't Rabban Gamliel an individual? According to this reasoning, his figures in the moon should have been forbidden, as they would have aroused suspicion. The Gemara answers, since he was the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, members of the public would often be found with him, and therefore there was no room for suspicion. And if you wish, say there is an alternative answer, namely that these figures were not whole, rather that they were formed from pieces of figures that had to be assembled. Only complete figures are forbidden. And if you wish, say that there is yet another answer. Fashioning figures in order to teach oneself is different, as it is taught in a Braita with regard to the verse. You shall not learn to do like the abominations of those nations, Deuteronomy 18, verse 9. But you may learn in order to understand the matter yourself and teach it to others. In other words, it is permitted to perform certain acts for the sake of Torah study that would otherwise be prohibited. The Mishnah in 42b teaches that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, those figures that are upon respectable vessels are forbidden. Those that are upon disgraceful vessels are permitted. The Gemara asks, what vessels are considered respectable and which are considered disgraceful? So Rav says, these terms do not represent different types of vessels, but rather the location of the figure upon the vessel. A respectable location for an idolatrous figure is on the side of the vessel above the level of the water or food contents. A disgraceful location is below the water level. And Shmuel says both these and those locations on eating utensils are disgraceful. Rather, these are respectable locations, upon bracelets and upon nose rings and upon rings. The Gemara comments, it is taught in Braita in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel, Tosefta 5:1. Respectable locations for idolatrous figures are upon bracelets, or upon nose rings, or upon rings. Disgraceful locations are upon large pots, or upon small kettles, or upon samovars, or upon sheets, or upon towels. So Rabbi Yoshi says, when one encounters an idol, he should grind the idol and throw the dust to the wind or cast it into the sea. The rabbi said to him, what is the good of that? That also gives a Jew benefit from the idol as it becomes fertilizer for his crops. And deriving any kind of benefit is prohibited, as it is stated, and nothing of the prescribed items shall cleave to your hand, Deuteronomy 13, verse 18. The Gemara now says, it is taught in a Braita, that is Tosefta 3:16, Rabbi Yoshi said to them, but isn't it already stated, and your sin? And then it continues in tomorrow's Daf 44. So thanks for watching.